In the previous lecture, we encountered Thales of Miletus, and we noted how he stands at the head of a tradition of Greek natural philosophical inquiry. The kind of inquiry, the kind of questions, and the kind of assumptions that Thales, and more importantly his successors, created were not only novel relative to what we know about Egyptian and Babylonian thought, but also formed the foundation for the subsequent history of Western science. In this lecture, we're going to look at Thales' successors, the Presocratic philosophers. Now, what are the Presocratic philosophers? Well, fairly simply stated, it's a group of thinkers that lived between the time of Thales, about 600 BC, up until the death of Socrates in 399 BC, so about a 200-year period. But, I always feel that when I start a lecture like this, someone is going to ask, why do we care about these guys? Don't they belong in a history of philosophy course, not a history of science course? Well, there are really three responses to that. First of all, you have to remember what I said in the introductory lecture, that we have to transcend the narrow modern definition of science if we really want to understand the foundations of science. That definition is relatively modern, and so we would cut a lot of material out of the history of science. It's important to aid our understandings if we used just that. Second of all, the Presocratics, many of them were involved in natural philosophical investigations, so astronomy, for example. Third, they were the first, at least the first we know of, to ask questions that have been asked ever since by scientists. What is the world made of? How is it put together? How do we gain true knowledge about the natural world? How much do we trust our senses? How do we get a handle on what the world is made of and how it's put together? So in this sense, these early Greek philosophers set the philosophical frameworks for the study of nature that we've been using, with obvious adjustments, ever since. So they really are the crucial starting point for the history of Western science. Now, there are two other things I need to say about the Presocratics before we begin. First of all, as interesting as they are, or seem to be to us, we have no full texts from them. All we have are fragments, quotations made by later writers, citing, quoting, paraphrasing their ideas. And it gives scholars a great deal of joy and befuddlement to try and sift those fragments to see how they go together. Well, that means that it's often very difficult to get a really clear handle on what they were trying to say. It's as if you only had a few segments out of a long book and tried to figure out what the whole book was about. Nonetheless, those fragments are tantalizing. The second thing is that talking about the Presocratics can sometimes degenerate into something like a laundry list. So-and-so said this, such and such did this, and so forth. So they can be a little bit atomized. We want to avoid that. Well, the way to do that is to remember that most of the Presocratics were aware of each other's writings. They tended to address the same questions. It's like they were having a conversation over a 200-year period. Plato and Aristotle, in due course, joined that conversation. And in fact, it's not too much to say that some of that conversation is still going on today in laboratories around the world where scientists are still trying to find out something about the natural world. So, let's go back now and eavesdrop a little bit on the beginning of the conversation. Well, one of the significant things that Thales of Miletus did was to attract some followers in his hometown of Miletus, and together they form what's called the Milesian School. One of the early associates of Thales was Anaximander. Now, Anaximander, certainly, like Thales, knew about Babylonian and Egyptian eclipse records, mathematics, and that sort of thing. Anaximander flourished around 570 BC. One of the things he's reputed to have done is to introduce the gnomon to the Greeks. Now, what on earth is a gnomon? A gnomon is just a stick. Very simple scientific instrument. The way it's used, you stick it in the ground, make sure it's perfectly perpendicular, and you can use it to measure the direction of the sun and its altitude. You measure the height of the gnomon and the length of the shadow, and then you can calculate the angle of the sun above the horizon, or the moon for that matter. It's used for surveying. It's also used in time reckoning. The thing in the middle of a sundial that sticks up that casts the shadow, that also is a gnomon. There's also a story that Thales of Miletus measured the height of the pyramids in Egypt by waiting until the point of time in the day that the length of a shadow was equal to the height of the thing. So he probably used a gnomon to do this. He was probably watching the length of the shadow of his gnomon changing, and when it was the same, he went out and measured the pyramids, the shadow of the pyramids at least. Now, the other interesting thing that Anaximander did was that he gave a physical description of the Earth and what's around it. The Earth is shaped, according to Anaximander, like the drum of a column. It's circular in cross-section and flat on both faces, and we live on one of those faces. Now, this may sound awfully simplistic. However, there's an inventive leap in it. The Earth is not supported by anything. And Anaximander says it hangs in the middle of the heavens the way it does because it's equidistant from everything else. So he subverts this commonsensical idea of up and down and says, no, there's just center and outward from center. So nothing needs to hold the Earth up. He also tried to provide a structure of the cosmos. He says that there are 3 solid rings surrounding the Earth, and these rings are filled with fire. The smallest ring is 9 Earth radii away, and it has lots of little holes in it that allow the fire to shine through, and those we see as the stars. The next ring is 18 Earth radii around, and it has one large vent in it, as he calls it, that allows us to see the interior fire, and that's what we see as the moon. And likewise, at 27 Earth radii away is a similar ring with a vent that we see as the sun. Eclipses are caused when those vents get partially or entirely blocked. Now again, this may seem to be a very simplistic idea, but nonetheless, there are a couple of things in it that merit notice. One of them is that he gives an idea as to why eclipses occur, a naturalistic explanation of the origin of the eclipse. Second of all, what about those numbers, 9, 18, and 27? Where in the world do those come from? Well, we can be pretty sure they don't come from any kind of calculation. They presumably come from some kind of importance that Anaximander attached to the number 9, because they're the multiples 1, 2, and 3 of 9. But the idea that he used those numbers says something. It says that he imagined that there should be some kind of elegant and mathematical way of describing the cosmos. It's not put together randomly or unintelligibly. It's that there are mathematical unities in it somehow. Well, that's about all we know about Anaximander. A still younger colleague at Miletus, Anaximenes, we know even less about. He flourished around 550 BC, and about the only thing I need to say about him is that he, like Thales, posited a universal material substrate of all things. And for him, it was air. He said air can thicken and become clouds and vapors, water, mud, and earth, or it can be rarefied into fire. So everything is really air, according to Anaximenes. That attempt was an attempt to locate some kind of uniformity and stability amid the diversity of substances and the diversity of changes in the world. And it provides a background to the second pair of Presocratics I want to talk about. One of these is Heraclitus of Ephesus. I'll be perfectly frank with you and tell you that I really like Heraclitus. He's my favorite of the Presocratics. He seems to have been quite a bit of a curmudgeon. He says some wonderfully nasty things about his fellow Ephesians, and we have quite a large number of fragments from him. The other one that I want to contrast with him is his younger contemporary, Parmenides. These two, Heraclitus, Parmenides, held largely opposing views of the nature of change in the physical world and the value of sense perception for studying it. Central to Heraclitus's thought is the idea that everything flows. That is, everything is changing constantly. Now, you may have heard of one of Heraclitus's most famous fragments. That is, you cannot step twice into the same river. What does that mean? What it probably means is that even a simple, repeated action is impossible because there's so much change in the world. The waters of the river flow on, and so between your first and second step, it's a different river. Turn it around a little bit. You cannot step twice into the same river. So between the first and second step, you've changed too. Thus, fire is central to Heraclitus. It is the source and the end of everything, and it is emblematic of constant change. Well, with this idea of change, did Heraclitus actually give up the notion of there being any constancy in the world? If he had, he would have been radically antithetical to scientific thought, because scientific thought depends upon certain constants, certain fundamental, unchanging principles or laws in the world. Heraclitus argued that beneath the constant change there was a principle of uniformity, what he called the logos. Now, logos is a hard Greek word to translate. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean simply word or argument, but it can also mean reason, principle, and proportion. And it's probably that way that Heraclitus uses it, that there are constant, unchanging principles and proportions in the way the world is put together beneath the changes. How does Heraclitus think we should discover the principles underlying change in nature? Well, he does value the senses for giving us information of the natural world, but the crux of the matter is that those senses have to be rightly interpreted. If we don't interpret them rightly, we are led astray. One of his fragments says, "Eyes and ears are bad witnesses for men with barbarian souls." In other words, if your mind is not disciplined and ordered in a rational way, the testimony of the senses will lead you astray. They will be bad witnesses. Now, it takes patience and it takes wisdom to uncover what is beneath the apparent change in nature. And Heraclitus sums this up in another wonderful fragment: nature loves to hide. Now, any modern scientist that's worked in a research laboratory for any period of time will know exactly what Heraclitus means by that. The meanings, the hidden meanings of things are not to be found on the surface. Nature is playing a game with us. She loves to hide, and we have to go and catch her. Now, although Heraclitus valued rightly understood sense perception, his near contemporary Parmenides did not. Parmenides lived around 475 BC in Elea, one of the Greek colonies in southern Italy. It's unclear if he had ever heard of Heraclitus far away in Ephesus at about the same time. But the point is that for Parmenides, the change that is everywhere present for Heraclitus is mere illusion. Nothing changes. This means that sense perception that tells us that things are changing, the sense perception that's key to the observation of nature, is useless and vain. Now, Parmenides divided everything into two categories: that which is and that which is not. And he says that one never moves into the other. Nothing comes out of nothing, ever. That which is always is. So, when we sense that some things come into existence or go out of existence, that's an illusion. Now, don't just smile and think of Parmenides as being trite, dividing things into existent and non-existent things, because Parmenides' questions really troubled his successors, and every later Presocratic, Aristotle and Plato as well, had to respond to Parmenides. He was incredibly influential. In fact, he was working on the same theme as his predecessors, trying to find some constant principle in the world. He just did so not by saying change is everywhere and there's some underlying constancy. He does it by dismissing the possibility of change, dismissing it as an illusion. What's perhaps so important about Parmenides and the Eleatics, the people who followed him, Zeno, for example, is the willingness to give up the testimony of the senses. Now, this sounds a bit strange to us. We're going to give up the testimony of the senses? Well, wait just a second. Modern science asks us to do that constantly. Feel the ground under your feet. It feels pretty solid to me. Yet I'm supposed to believe that this ground underneath me is moving at over 700 miles an hour, just from the rotation of the Earth, not to mention the Earth speeding through the heavens around the sun. Modern atomic theory tells me that this lectern is 99.999999% nothing. But you know, as far as I can tell, it feels like something more than nothing to me. If I go running towards the wall, modern science tells me that my head and that wall are mostly void space. But I'm pretty certain that I'm going to crack my head if I run against that wall. And I think I'm going to feel that if I try it. Right? So there's a lot in modern science that asks us to pass beyond sense perception. So it's the validity of the senses relative to the validity of disembodied logical or mathematical abstract logic. They lie at the core, I think, of modern science. Well, the Presocratics we've dealt with so far can be classed as monists. They held that although physical substances seem to be diverse, there's really a unity among them. They share a commonality. This is water in the case of Thales, or air for Anaximenes, or simply being for Parmenides. An opposing school of pluralists held that instead of just one, there are many realities, many substances underlying the diversity of observable things. The most important of these was Empedocles. Empedocles' traditional dates are 484 to 424 BC. And like Parmenides, he lived in one of the Western Greek colonies, in this case, Agrigentum in Sicily. Now, if you go to the current Italian town of Agrigento in Sicily, you can still see there impressive remains of the ancient Greek colony, wonderful temples, quite well preserved. At Agrigentum, Empedocles practiced medicine and purportedly started a school of medicine there. Empedocles' views on matter and the changes of matter strike me as being a compromise between Parmenidean and Heraclitean ideas. Empedocles is credited most with the concept of the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. He called them the four roots of things, and what he meant exactly by that is not always clear. But the elements allow him to reject Parmenides' dismissal of change, but preserve the impossibility of coming into being and passing out of being. How does it do that? Well, change occurs when the elements come together, mix together in one proportion to form one thing, then fall apart, separate, and recombine to form something else. So the elements remain, they go neither into being or out of being, but the individual objects caused by their mixtures do. In Empedocles' words, he says there is no birth and death of things, but rather only the mingling and the exchange of parts. Why do the elements combine and separate? Well, he says that two forces act on them. One he calls love or friendship, and the other he calls strife. Now, these rather oddly titled forces, they don't sound very scientific to us, but they're part of Empedocles' language. Empedocles writes in verse, for example. He's a poet. How does love and strife work? Well, he says at the beginning of the universe, the four elements were separate. And the power of love, or friendship, philia is the Greek word he uses, brings them together and they combine and generate the world. At some point, strife is going to gain the upper hand, though, over love. And the universe will collapse, will come to an end, and the elements will retire to their original places. And Empedocles also says that at some point the whole process will begin again. Now, later Christians, to jump ahead several centuries, sometimes found Empedocles of interest because of his view on the end of the world. And there's one beautiful example of this. If you see the wonderful 15th century frescoes painted by Luca Signorelli in the cathedral at Orvieto, they show, for example, the Last Judgment and the resurrection of the dead, but there's also a fresco of the end of the world. And it shows the stars falling out of the skies and the angel of the apocalypse blowing his trumpet. People are dying everywhere. The world is dissolving into chaos. Well, if you look at the frame that's painted around this fresco, there's a little portal, and there is a man, who is Empedocles, leaning out, looking up at the fresco to watch the dissolution of the world that he had theorized. Well, Empedocles' cosmogony, that is, how the world is created, implies a certain level of randomness. The elements come together in various ways, but they don't always produce something good at first. And this becomes very clear in his description of the origins of living creatures. Let me read you one of the fragments. He says, "There sprang up on the earth many heads without necks. Arms were wandering about unattached to shoulders, with eyes rolling around in want of foreheads." Well, depending on the state of one's stomach, this is either amusing or revolting as an image. But it implies that there's a level of randomness, of random mixing, and it takes time to get it right. The next person we want to look at, Anaxagoras, who lived from about 500 BC to about 425 BC, partly in Athens, would have none of this randomness. For him, the origin of the world is not the blind forces of love and strife, but rather nous, that is, mind. Randomness doesn't play a role. Now, here, between Anaxagoras and Empedocles, we have an important division in pre-Socratic thought, one that Plato and Aristotle again would pick up on. It's the debate over the randomness of nature or the design in nature. Is nature a product of chance? Is the world a product of chance or a product of a design? Clearly, this is something we're still arguing about today. And the roots of this debate, some of the answers to this debate, some of the arguments for it, date back to the Presocratics. Now, the union of many of these foregoing ideas appears in the work of the last set of Presocratics I want to talk about, and these are the atomists. Leucippus, who flourished about 430 BC, is generally seen to be the founder of this school, but we have very little information about Leucippus. We have a little bit more about his student, Democritus of Abdera, a little bit younger. The two of them postulated that there were only two things in the universe: atoms, which were invisibly small particles of stuff, moving in void space. In a sense, it's a combination of Parmenides' two kinds of things: being, the atoms, non-being, the void. The atoms are minute, indivisible particles of various shapes and sizes, and they're in constant motion. The word atom comes from the Greek atomos, which literally means uncuttable. So these are indivisible bits of matter. Visible things are created when clumps, hordes of atoms clump together into something big enough so that we can actually see it. Things cease to be when they fall apart back again into their atoms, and the atoms congregate into some other object. So again, both Heraclitean change, the falling apart and the coming together of atoms, is preserved, as well as Parmenidean constancy. The atoms are eternal. There are also monists, Democritus and the atomists, because there's only one kind of stuff the atoms are made out of. Atomism involves something else, though. It also involves a rejection of sense perception. We can't see the atoms, we can't taste them, we can't smell them. In fact, the differences that we do perceive, the color of a table, the taste of honey versus the taste of vinegar, right? The warmth of a summer day versus the cold of ice, these are all just conventions. They're not actually real qualities. They come about only because of the shapes and the arrangements of the atoms. Our senses sense shapes and arrangements of atoms, and we perceive this as being colors and smells and tastes. But that's not really, there's no taste in honey. It's only the way we perceive it. Now, the atomic view is a classical case of reductionism. That is, the desire to reduce the maximum number of individual phenomena or observations to the minimum number of causes. Well, with atomism, some of you may think that we've finally gotten to an idea that's still held by modern science. Well, yes and no. First of all, Democracy and atomism is very different from modern atomic theory. But I think more importantly than that is that Democracy and atomism was really thoroughly rejected in Antiquity for a number of reasons, a number of logical reasons. Aristotle lined up a whole slew of logical arguments against it, as did others, and we'll talk about those in a later lecture. But moreover, and this is the historical point, atomism picked up some distasteful baggage along the way. This often happens with scientific ideas. Often we can have an idea which is quite good, that may explain some phenomena, has some backing from various observations or reasonings, but it picks up something distasteful. Okay? That's what happened to atomism, because the biggest popularizer of atomism in Greek antiquity was Epicurus. And for Epicurus, atomism was at the core of his ethical system. In an atomistic world that's totally random, things are created by the random motions of atoms. There is no good or bad luck. There are no gods to placate. Epicurus is sort of the don't worry, be happy school of ancient philosophy. You can't do anything about the world. You can't placate gods. There is no such thing as fortune. It's all just random, so just live your life and don't worry about it. Well, the avowed atheism of Epicureanism, and particularly the hedonistic excesses of later self-styled Epicureans that Epicurus himself would not have liked, made atomism distasteful to a lot of people in subsequent centuries, particularly to Christians. So by the end of the ancient world, atomism was fairly well rejected as an idea to explain the natural world. Nonetheless, about 2,000 years later, Democritean and Epicurean atomism were revived in the 17th century, where they became part of a new and important history. But that's far in the future for us. That's about 20 lectures ahead. Let me say something about why atoms were bad. Not their moral connections, but why they were rejected. Well, there are two parts to Aristotle's rejection, for example. One is that you have to have void to have atoms, and Aristotle would have nothing to do with the void for a number of reasons. One was that he said that a moving body moved in proportion to the thickness, the density of the medium. So we know that this is true. If you take a billiard ball and you drop it through the air, it drops quite quickly. Drop it through water, it drops more slowly. Drop it through molasses, it drops considerably more slowly. Well, with a void, you would have no resistance. Therefore, the speed of an object would be infinite. It would end its journey at the same moment it began it, which is impossible. The atoms are another problem. What are they really? How can they have shapes and sizes and yet be indivisible? That doesn't make any sense for Aristotle. Either they have shapes and sizes and they can be divided, at least logically, they have parts, or they are mathematical points. And if they're mathematical points, well then you could put an infinite number of them together and it would still never amount to anything. So they can't be decent building blocks. Fine. Well, that's a quick survey of some various pre-Socratic schools. By the time Socrates, and more importantly his pupil Plato, appeared on the scenes, Greek thinkers had chewed over a number of important issues, and I think there are four of them to mention. One is the origin of the world. How did it come to be, and in what way? The second one, what is the nature of change? Is change real? Is change an illusion? How do we rationalize how change happens? The third has to do with the reliability of the senses. How far do we trust our eyes and ears? And the fourth is, what is the underlying reality of the world? Plato and Aristotle would both respond to these formulations on their own. But in a sense, many of the basic questions they addressed, and which modern science continues to address, had been formulated in this pre-Socratic conversation. Now, in the next two lectures, what we're going to do is look at Plato and his responses to the pre-Socratics, and at one other pre-Socratic school we haven't mentioned yet, the mysterious Pythagoreans.